Good evening, everyone. I am really pleased to welcome all of you today on behalf of the Art Deco Mumbai Trust, my fellow trustees, Professor Mustansir Dalvi and Sujata Parekh Kumar, my colleagues from the Trust, and of course our guests, Professor Debashree Mukherjee and Paromita Vohra. The credit for this evening's draw must surely go to Debashree and Paromita, since Debashree published her definitive book, Bombay Hustle, in 2020. The pandemic and supply chain issues made getting her book a difficult proposition. As is human nature, the harder it got, the more determined my search became. I finally got a copy from Bahari Sons in New Delhi. Bombay Hustle is a true delight. At the end of the book, there is a list of selected readings. That is preceded by a 20-page index. Yes, 20 rich pages. A 17-page biblio. And 54 pages of notes. As a keen reader and researcher, you can imagine my delight, and you will appreciate the rich treasure trove that this book holds within itself. Leave aside the main text. I quote Nipa Majumdar, who remarked, Bombay Hustle offers a methodological model for media historians with its staggering and creative array of sources. Today's talk is set in the context of a modern emerging Bombay. It was a time when the first train set out for Thane from BT station. Relentless urban pressures and the plague forced the administration to look for more land, initiating the reclamation of the Oval Precinct, followed by Marine Drive. Apartment-style living brought a modern aspiration to life. On film sets, the use of electric lights ushered in a whole new paradigm. Commercial interests thrived under colonialism, with cotton and opium kings partnering with the state to usher in a modern Bombay. Churchgate Street was vibrant with bars, nightclubs, fine dining, and the finest jazz musicians from the world over. The bedrocks of diversity, multiculturalism, and cosmopolitanism were laid within the embrace of a rich cultural milieu. A long-time resident of Marine Drive told me, if you walked into a restaurant and did not ask an unaccompanied lady for a dance, it was considered rude or ungentlemanly. Such was the mahal of those times. It is against this backdrop that Debashree's lecture is timely and pertinent, as she shares her research on the women of that era emerging into the workforce, especially in film. Bombay was the epitome of modernity, but there were realities that we did not see or did not know about, which Debashree will share with us today. Debashree is Associate Professor in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University in New York. Her book, Bombay Hustle, Making Movies in a Colonial City, approaches film history as an ecology of material practices and practitioners. She has published on feminist film historiography, labor, and cities in various film journals and anthologies. She is editor-in-chief of Bioscope, South Asian Screen Studies, and her next book, Mediated Ocean, develops an eco-media history of indentured migration and plantation capitalism in Mauritius, Fiji, and the Andamans. In a previous life, and this is what I find very interesting and fascinating, Debashree worked in Mumbai's film and TV industries as an assistant director, writer, and camera person. I think this unique experience of hers within Bollywood lays the bedrock for her to be an outstanding academician and be able to bridge the gap between the realities of working in the industry and then teaching and holding forth on it as an academic. So thank you for being here, Debashree. The evening is all yours.
So it's just such a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. Bombay Hustle, my book was published in October 2020, and as you might or might not recall, things just seem very far away right now. It was a time when the entire world seemed kind of locked down, and we didn't know what would happen and how we would travel and how books would be read and how books would travel. So this is the first time that I'm actually able to present a book, a talk on my book in Bombay, and I'm really very, very grateful to Art Deco Mumbai for this opportunity. And thank you so much, Atul. Also, what a lovely and generous introduction. I'll have to watch the recording just to feel like that lovely feeling that I had like listening to you just now. So thank you so much for reading with such care and pulling out the things. So it's really, really lovely to have a gift of such an attentive reader who can appreciate the things that, you know, a lot of people overlook. Thanks also to Suhasini. You've just been marvelous and doing all this great work behind the scenes, and I know you must be stressed out that there's traffic on the streets right now, but thank you for organizing this today. I also just want to quickly shout out to Mahima Mehta, with whom I started my journey in Bombay as an assistant director. I don't even want to say which year that was. It was many, many years ago. So I'll just actually begin. The way we've structured the event today is I'll be speaking for about 40-45 minutes. I'll be showing you a bunch of slides. I think Paromita is here now, and we'll have a discussion after that. Okay, so I want to begin with a quote. The talk today is titled "Cinema as a Modern Workplace for Women." And if you can't hear me, everyone can hear me. Okay. So I'll begin with a quote. When Annette saw her first Indian film, she was stunned. She felt it was all like magic. Instantly, she felt the urge to be a part of that magic. Many times after that first time, Annette slipped away from home at great risk to see the magic, till one day she saw the shooting of a film in which she saw Sulochana for the first time. Oh, she was so beautiful. When she came down the steps, I almost lost my heartbeats. She was like an angel, a goddess, coming down from heaven. Now, the year here is approximately 1929. This is Sulochana, the reigning screen goddess of the times, glamour incarnate. Annette is a young mixed-race woman longing for a life of freedom and beauty away from the strict discipline of her family. She has very little interest in the acceptable professions for a woman of her standing. Those jobs would be nursing or stenography. But cinema offers her something quite different, a very different kind of promise. In the years to follow, Annette remakes herself as Madame Azuri, a self-taught dancer and one of the first choreographers of Bombay cinema. And if you haven't heard of her, there is a reason to this, and it is part of the work that I think me and many other film historians today are trying to do to recuperate and recover the stories of women and other kinds of practitioners and work that have not really been centered thus far. Now, what I'm trying to point at with this opening vignette is that the fans' drive to enter directly into cinema as a performer or a practitioner points to a very complex history of urban work and modernity. There are aspirations here of individual self-fulfillment, desires for financial independence, for a creative life, and even perhaps a spectacular life. So in today's talk, I want to stay with some of these ideas, the ways in which cinema in the 20th century relayed desires and dreams and produced new visions of the working self. Now, cinema is a powerful assemblage that activates people and things and sets them into motion. So we all will agree that the spectator's body is impacted by the screen. Movies move us. They move us to tears. They move us to laughter. But cinema is not just an entertainment form. It is an industrial and a vocational form as well. Cinema is also an employer. And as an employer, cinema has the power to put bodies to work. Now, while the representational politics of cinema is regularly studied by academics and critics, less attention is paid to the human labor and the practices that go into the production of media. In Bombay Hustle, Making Movies in a Colonial City, I present a history of filmmaking in late colonial Bombay, and the time period is roughly 1920s to the 1940s. And I present this history from the point of view of practitioners and makers. And for those that are interested, and this is my first and only chance to pitch book sales, you may purchase a copy of my book at your nearest online vendor in case you can't make it to Bari Sons in Delhi. Now, what I want to just spend a little time on is this word practice that will come up again and again, both in my book and in my talk. What does this word mean? And what do I mean by the word practice, which is at the center of Bombay Hustle? Practice for me, and this is will also be intuitive as you listen to this, practice is a repetitive activity that is oriented to a future. It is a rehearsal of a task and the rehearsal of the self that is being produced by that task. It is a set of learned habits of the body, and it is tied to a specific time and place and also tied to specific objects. So what do I mean by this? A film actress, for example, practices her craft at the intersection of her body, her institutional location, costumes, props, co-actors, cameras, and lights. In practicing her craft, the actress shows herself as continually becoming actress, trying to change, adapt, improve, but always along with these other entangled others. So practice, and this is what I'm trying to get at, is fundamentally relational, which means that no matter how hard you try to perfect and stabilize your practice, you will always be dependent on several forces that insert an unpredictability into each gesture that you make. For example, a motion picture camera can work most efficiently when it articulates with a camera operator within an energy grid that can power the machine with stable voltage, right? The cinematographer and the camera are defined by their relation to each other, but they're also dependent on a whole network of uncredited and often unobserved actors, agents, such as gaffers, light stands, light attendants, camera assistants, reflectors, electricity, film stock. Now, this entire network of actors, once you start to see it, right, once you start to recognize it, tells us something, that filmmaking is a very complex and a collaborative set of operations, and that this idea of creativity and creative agency is dispersed across a film set. Not just the sole kind of, the repository is not just one creative genius perhaps on set, but it's a dispersed kind of an agency. Just a quick aside, all the black and white production stills like this that you will see in the presentation today are from the very remarkable photographic archive of the German cinematographer Joseph Wersching, who moved to India in the 1930s and was the principal cinematographer for Bombay Talkies studio, which was set up in Malad. So I just want to kind of credit that all these images are from the Wersching family. They've shared them with me for our talk today. Now, this entire force field of relations that I'm trying to kind of discuss today that swirls around the apparatus of filmmaking is what I describe in the book as a cine ecology. Cinema in this account is far more than what ends up on the film screen. Cinema is an ecology of practices that embraces hundreds of gestures, activities, techniques that take place long before the final film product reaches the theater. So by this logic, right, if you accept this logic, then the work of ideating, writing, dancing, waiting on the sets for the next shot, or even dreaming of a big break, whether you're sitting in Versova or in Vasai, are equal parts, and ought to be equal parts of the history of cinema. As different bodies practiced cinema in Bombay's late colonial cine ecology, they also crafted fresh imaginations of who they were and what they could be. And in the process, cinema altered the city, and a new historical figure came into being, a figure that we can call the cine worker. And this is a brand new historical figure, right? Cinema is emerging as a cultural form, and hence cinema workers are appearing on the historical stage for the first time. So for today, I have promised Art Deco Mumbai that I will focus on the female cine worker in order to unpack what cinema meant as a modern workplace for women and how foundational this pioneering generation of women workers was to the Bombay film industry as we know it today. I will discuss a few different types of labor via a series of stories and historical protagonists. You will find that some of these stories are highly surprising, and you will find that others seem rather painfully familiar, even from a 2022 perspective. And this is just a little summary of the kinds of work and roles that I will try and touch today. Now, as is well known, acting work in Indian cinema was initially regarded as taboo for women. The earliest silent films in the subcontinent featured male actors in female roles. I'll just come back to this in a bit. Gradually, women who belonged to parallel performance traditions such as courtesans, nautch girls, stage actresses started to enter the film trade. The entry of Muslim professional singers and Anglo-Indian actresses into the film workforce created a different kind of frisson or tension even. Now, women's sexuality has historically been the locus for waging political and religious battles in South Asia. And Paromita writes about this practically daily. In the mid-1930s, actresses' bodies became contested territory in India, especially as talks of independence and rumors of a faith-based partition started to intensify. Studio bosses and celebrity journalists started to advocate a drive to recruit respectable women. And by this, they meant very explicitly educated Hindu women, preferably married, who were tasked with the job of changing the reputation of the industry and better embodying what would be the ideal Indian woman on screen, as opposed to the nation's others, such as Muslim, Anglo-Indian, or Dalit actresses. So alongside these anxieties about who was best suited to play ideal Indian womanhood on screen and who could change the taboo reputation of the film industry, there were other anxieties also about the film actress, and those went beyond social identity. The actress as star in the 1930s and 40s was a hyper-visible icon of female earning power, and she could actually possess many of the objects that were associated with her on screen. So this article about Naseem Banu's saris and perfumes is a case in point. And it says of course, Naseem thinks Shanta is wonderful, but she spends thousands on saris and perfumes, and she's beautiful but terribly shy. Now, for those that may not know, Naseem Banu is Saira Banu's mother. I just wanted to mention that as an aside. Now, the point here is that the film actress, the Abhinetri, the Sitara, posed a very startling model of financial power, and fans were transfixed by stories of star salaries and star consumption. Now, let me show you a few more examples from the archives. So that's in case you didn't know who Saira Banu was. Now, there's a few interesting things that are happening here. Now, fans were writing in, obsessed with these details, right? So someone says in a letter to the editor from 1938, I want to know the exact pay of Shanta Apte. That's the first question. Can you supply me a photograph in a natural pose? And is there any relationship between Shantaram and Apte? So of course, the three orders of questions, right? How much money does she make? Who is she? And of course, is there a scandal associated with her? So judging from a variety of archival sources that I've looked at for the book, it is clear that star actresses were also earning higher salaries than their male counterparts. So here's a kind of some, and you only get very fragmented bits of evidence like this. So Sita Devi, whose birth name is Renee Smith, gets 2,000 per month. Sulochana gets 2,000 per month. Zubeda gets 2,000 per month. Prithviraj gets 450 per month. Jairaj gets 400 per month. So this is even less than half if you think about the comparison, right? And today when we talk about pay parity and so on, this is quite startling that the situation was so reversed this is 1932. And we can discuss why that might be, right? So it's very clear that women, and especially if you were a star actress, you were earning much higher salaries than your male counterparts. You were also advertising everyday commodities, right? So it was the women that were the brand ambassadors that were doing advertisements in this early moment, from telephones to of course Lux. They were the engine of commercial success. And so it is these women that actually laid the foundations of the film industry, making it into a viable commercial form in the way that we know it today. And they also served as role models for thousands of young women like Annette, who were trying to imagine exciting and independent futures for themselves. Now these women, who are modern working women, working in a technologized workplace that was also a highly public space, posed a very perplexing challenge to Indian society. Now one of these challenges was the dilemma of the heterosocial workplace. That question about what is the relationship between Shantaram and Shanta Apte. And Durga Khote summarized this really succinctly in her memoirs. She says, a question I have been asked over and over again is, how do you feel when you co-star with unknown men? Do you feel attracted? And she says the question always amused me. I don't blame people for not knowing how much pressure the camera puts on actors. Makeup, costumes, jewelry, the rise and fall of the voice, memorizing lines. Where was there any place in all of this for attraction? And this is one of the things that she really feels compelled to say at the end of her acting career. Now what is she trying to say here? She's saying that the technically skilled practice, her technically skilled practice, her work was never truly taken seriously in the popular discourse, in the journalistic discourse. It was always overshadowed by the more sensational curiosity about affairs and flirtations. This also means that an actress's work was always already sexualized in popular perception, and innuendos such as this were commonplace. So this is also kind of helping me transition now to thinking about the talkies. And the new studio, the new Ranjit studio, it is big and beautiful with such perfect acoustics that if the director tried a tete-a-tete in whispers, it would all come out on this soundtrack, right? So the only point to be noted about the perfect acoustics of the studio is what you might hear that might be sensational or scandalous. Now this kind of speculative journalism, which later becomes what is known as yellow journalism, led to major laments about the bad influence that actresses have on society. And so opinions started to proliferate that sought to shut down acting entirely as a vocation for women. So this kind of a debate was happening almost every day in the journals and newspapers and film magazines of the time, right? Beware of these screen nymphs. Should cultured girls take up acting? Why shouldn't cultured girls take up on acting? From the point of view of chastity, is there any difference between a film actress and a family girl? So this respectability question becomes a very vexing question, and it becomes a real kind of a danger in terms of viability. Who can take up this highly lucrative work and who cannot? Now I want to discuss one of the ways in which actresses were called on to defend their right to work via the medium of films. But for this we have to first understand what was the novelty of the talking picture in 1930s South Asia. Now sound transformed the career of cinema in India. So till the 1920s, Indian cinemas were playing second fiddle to Hollywood stunt serials. Right? Indian language films, now with the coming of the talkies, became the dominant cultural form, as we know, of the 20th century. Now the success of the talkies is commonly attributed to the fact that the subcontinent has traditionally been interested in music and song. But I want to look at a slightly different element of sound, which is speech, speaking, dialogue. the emphatically public form of an impassioned, speechifying voice. And I discuss this in great detail in chapter 3 of my book, in case you want to look at it in more detail. Now, the thing that I started to find as I was thinking and looking at the films and the remnants of the films from the 30s was that there is an aesthetics of very passionate oration that defines the first years of sound cinema in India. And it helps us understand why it is that there is a continuing importance of dialogue even today in mainstream film. Now, this slide is partly an excuse for me to show an image of Shah Rukh Khan, but it's not just that. It's just an example also of the hundreds of scenes of very impassioned, what we in India call dialogue delivery. Nowhere in the world is this a phrase that is understood, dialogue delivery. But we understand it, and we often see that a kind of imagined or real courtroom scenario becomes the context for this kind of impassioned dialogue delivery. And it's also been a vehicle for the production of stardom itself. So some of the biggest stars are constantly kind of consolidated because they're given the best dialogues, either at the entry or some climactic moment. People memorize their dialogues, they talk the dialogues back to the screen and so on. So I was very interested in thinking about what that early talkie moment helps us understand, and why have we only been fixated on music and song as the only element, right, about thinking sound cinema. So I started studying scores of both surviving and lost films of the 1930s, and I found that the early talkie films frequently showed dramatic scenes of very impassioned oration, which were often taking place in fictional courtrooms. But what was very striking is that they invariably featured women as the speech makers and even lawyers. So these are two examples of very prominent actresses of the time who play lawyers at some moment or make these impassioned speeches in a courtroom in their films. Now, one of the fundamental paradoxes of the popularity of sound cinema in India was the body of the talking and singing and speaking film actress. Now, as I've already mentioned, in the years of silent cinema, Bombay's emerging film industry tried very hard to distance itself from the supposedly tainted female dancers and singers of another era, the Baijis who helped build Indian cinema. But during the talkie transition, these same supposedly tainted voices were also trained voices, and they provided a ready-made workforce and once again threatened the public space of cinema with a new kind of embodied charge. So once again in the talkie period, there is this whole renewed debate again about should respectable ladies join the films, what is the social status of cinema stars, and films themselves are being made with titles such as Actress Kyun Bani. Right? What was the compulsion to do this highly despicable kind of job? Now, film after film, I think, so one of the arguments I'm making in the book is that a certain kind of film that featured the speechifying, orating female character was also doing the work of defending the job of the actress. So film after film in the 1930s features women who are vocally defending either themselves or their loved ones through impassioned speech. And many of these, so I've just made a list of some of the films that had major climactic moments that were set in a courtroom. And you can see this is going on from the mid-30s to the late 40s. And there may be scores more of such films if we had access to the films from that time, and that's a whole different story. Now, whether it is Miss Gohar Mamajiwala in Miss 1933, who pleads her own case in court because she is accused in the film of murder in self-defense. That's just one example. Or in the film Bharat Ki Beti, where Ratan Bai masquerades as a man so that she can come and depose in the courtroom. Or whether it's the film Mother, in which the actress Manika defends Devika Rani in a courtroom trial. This is a film from 1936. Or a film like Jeevan Lata, in which Sabita Devi tries to defend her lover in court, we constantly see the courtroom that becomes a space for this kind of agonistic, impassioned dialogue and what is clearly excited and excitable speech. Actresses in these films often play what was called lady barristers, and very frequently their role in the film is to challenge conventional norms of society and legal ideas of morality. So they're constantly making these arguments about, according to society, this may be wrong, but from a mother's point of view, or from a lover's point of view, or from a girlfriend's point of view, this would actually be right. So there's this whole challenging of social and legalistic ideas of morality. Now, in a world outside of filmic representation, so I was obviously interested in why is this happening and does this at all correlate with what's happening in real courtrooms in India. But in the world outside of filmic representation, the presence of women in actual Indian courtrooms looked quite different. So we know that of an exceptional figure like say Cornelia Sorabji, first kind of female lawyer, but she also writes in her memoirs that very quickly in her lawyering career, there were subtle pressures that forced her to do office work, right, and not actually do argumentative work like pleading in the courtroom. Now, what was interesting for me is the connection between this passionate oration in the courtroom and political kinds of speeches and trials that are taking place. We have to remember this is also the height of the anti-colonial kind of freedom movement. So, for example, during the trials of Bhagat Singh, much ado was made of the supposedly hysterical behavior of Batukeshwar Dutt's sister, who apparently screamed and shouted in the courtroom, pouring abuse upon magistrate, police, government and all their generation. And she is unnamed across newspapers, they all report on this. And she also calls for the destruction of the government. She ends with what would have been at that time a highly controversial, provocative slogan, Mahatma Gandhi ki jai. She is removed from the courtroom, and after that all women are barred from attending these trials. It's a very gendered kind of treatment of a woman sitting in a courtroom, behaving in a particular way, just immediately branded hysterical. We know the gendered kind of a charge of a word like that. Now, this gender treatment of a politically active young woman, right, can be read as a strategic response by the government and by establishment newspapers. The Times of India clearly was at that time known to be an establishment newspaper as a response to the emergence of the educated middle class woman who was becoming a very visible and a dangerous actor in the independence movement. Now, the other thing I just wanted to quickly highlight is that the history of voice and sound in society and culture also has a very gendered kind of a backdrop. So, at least in Western societies, voice is seen as a direct channel to the self and to the truth of the self, my voice, my avaz, an emblem also of the rational, democratic male self. Now, the grainy and embodied voice, right, has historically been rendered feminine, at least in the Western imagination. And folks that study, say, music in film often think about this kind of dichotomy when they think about the opposition between a clean voice like a Lata Mangeshkar voice and an earthy voice where you can feel the body, right, like an Ela Arun kind of a voice. Now, in this context, it's very interesting to me that the courtroom films of the 1930s are deliberately confusing these boundaries between emotional and rational, right, between impassioned and cool and collected. Because we see female speaking subjects that are presenting highly emotional arguments, but in the language of the law. They are robe-wearing, trained lawyers themselves. So how do we think about this? Why is this happening? Why is cinema embracing this argumentative female voice? And there are many ways to think about this, especially we think about cinema as technology, aesthetics, and as industry. So cinema has often provided space for those things, ideas, practices that are considered in contemporary society as perhaps socially impossible or implausible. But cinema has been able to kind of push a little bit on those boundaries and give us intimations of things might happen, that could happen in the future. So while the impassioned lady barrister is not a reality in Indian society at that time, even in Bombay, cinema is in that sense kind of projecting this possibility, right, for the future. And is also bringing together this, like confusing these boundaries between rational, irrational, emotional, cool-headed, and feminine and masculine. What was also interesting is that frequently in these films, we see two generations of women within the courtroom, where a younger generation of an educated woman is defending an older generation of performing women. So for example, in Mother, right, this young woman, it turns out again in a kind of a gender reversed way of thinking, Avara, they are actually mother and daughter. In the narrative of the script, they are estranged. They only discover that they are related, right, in the courtroom. But the woman that is being defended is a dancer, and she is accused of murdering a pimp, right? And so we have this two different kinds of women, a modern, educated, Western trained, and that older demographic of the performing, tainted, supposedly other woman, which provides two different models of femininity. And what's for me why this was very compelling is that it allows a space for both those kinds of women to coexist in the same space in a kind of a very interesting way in which one woman is defending the right for the other woman to live, because these are often cases of being kind of tried for murder and hence capital punishment. So what I'm suggesting is that the film courtroom in this moment can be seen as a platform from which the industry and actresses are publicly arguing the case that stigmatized female voices and bodies ought to still have a right to work in the industry. And this becomes very literalized in an example such as Jeevan Lata with Sabita Devi, where a barrister hero is disgusted when he sees that his girlfriend is dancing in a public space. So he breaks up with her and she goes off to perhaps mourn, but not really. But when he is wrongly accused of murder, it is the dancing girl that comes back and defends him. And the reason that this actually happens is that the plot reveals that she actually is not a dancing girl, she just does that on the side. She is a trained barrister with a law degree from Oxford, no less. Right? So that's the final plot twist. So she's an Oxford educated lawyer who also happens to enjoy dancing. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this example is to highlight that the talkie actress, there were very complex kind of claims being made on her body, on her right to work and so on, right? Because they are at the same time real women playing fictional characters. They're Indian women performing types of Indian femininity, and that Indianness question is also very complicated, right? Because, for example, this is Sabita Devi, her name is emblazoned on the poster, but her birth name is Iris Gasper, right? Now she's an Anglo-Indian woman. She's taken on a particular screen name. She's playing certain kinds of models of idealized Hindu femininity. And it's a very complex kind of landscape in when there's a lot of kind of movement happening across and betwixt identities. And within all of this, the film actress is being asked to present her own case, right, through films themselves. So I want to move now to another very interesting case that has to do with Shanta Apte, who we saw referred to in film article. So this is an instance of a strike. So in July 1939, Shanta Apte goes on a hunger strike against Prabhat Studios employers, the executive board in Pune. So again, this is a very sensational event. She says that she is protesting against the arbitrary and uncivil treatment that is accorded to her by the directors of Prabhat Studio. The studio executives deny all these allegations and they say that this is blatantly untrue. but it creates a lot of buzz. It's an absolutely unprecedented event in the history of Indian cinemas as far as I know, definitely from that time period. Nobody was striking against their employers, not men, not women, not actors, not spot boys, not anyone. So this is a very interesting and exceptional form of rebellion, and it attracted many different kinds of reactions. So large crowds turned up at the gate of Prabhat Studio. And for those of you that are familiar with Pune today, Prabhat Studios is what is today FTII campus, right? So just think about the gates of FTII, where Shanta Apte is doing her hunger strike. Crowds have landed up, journalists, photographers are there to witness this very weird scene of a film actress on a hunger strike. A constable is posted there to keep fans in check. Newspapers in Singapore and Australia are reporting on this hunger strike. And Prabhat Studios issues a statement saying that Apte is a verbally abusive woman. She is unable to convey what she exactly wants, and we are not entertaining any of her demands. Now the reporters are wondering how this can happen, and some of them are saying that, okay, this makes sense because this is the kind of role she plays on screen. So for example, and so this is the Prabhat statement in which they completely dismiss, again in very gendered terms, Apte's demands. And this is a film that she's just done. It's a Prabhat film and it's been really big. It's called The Unexpected. You may know it as Dunya Na Mane or Kunku. And in that she plays this very, the plot is basically that she's a young woman, Neera, who was tricked into marrying a much older man. And once she discovers that she has been tricked into marrying this man who's old enough to be her father, she is completely livid, and it becomes a kind of a question of injustice and a fight against that injustice for her. And she treats her marriage as a space on which she has to protest. So what she does is, again, like the hunger strike, the character of Neera uses her body as protest. So she says, I will not consummate this marriage. That is my refusal of this unjust kind of a situation. So for me, there was interesting that the use of the body, either to say that I am going on hunger strike, which means I'm refusing the labor, right? I'm not going to do that work, and I have a right to my body, and I will deplete it if I choose to, but the Prabhat executive shall not. And Neera similarly doing something similar, using her body as a kind of a space for resistance. But ultimately, in the reportage that I have been able to access around this, there's no consensus on what this means, how do we understand it, right? Except that there's a very gendered kind of a dismissal of it. The context for this is important. So in the 1930s until the 40s, actors and actresses were hired on contracts and on salaries by film studios. They couldn't go from one studio to the other and so on. So Shanta Apte had like a 5-year contract with Prabhat Studios, and she was becoming hugely popular, and there was no way for her to monetize her popularity at that time. And she was getting very restless that after Kunku, Prabhat didn't cast her as a lead actress for 2 years. So she felt like they were using this contractual labor by not using it. She was like, give me work, let me actually at least act, right? So she wrote actually a very interesting pamphlet, a book, which is called Zaumi Cinemat, Should I Join the Movies, which she wrote and published in 1940, in which she discusses these questions of not just being overworked, but being underworked, right? And what that means for a film actress especially, who has a very short shelf life. So at the height of your popularity, given the nature of the industry then and now, you may not be able to work for more than 5, 6, 7 years. And if out of 2 years of that, you're just being made to sit and wait, that waiting itself for her becomes a very vexing kind of a question. Now I started to understand the logics of that hunger strike once I read this book. And it's a remarkable book. It's a Marathi language kind of a polemic. Many people call it a biography, but there's nothing actually biographical in it. It's written in what one can call, what has been called a Marathi Marxist vocabulary, and it's a political economy analysis of the film industry. So it really uses words like Bhandaval Shahi and so on, right, to talk about the film business as a capitalist enterprise and talk about it as an extractive enterprise. And I have talked about the book itself in more detail. I won't go into it now, but it's interesting that she writes it almost tongue-in-cheek. The question, should I join the movies, is based on the hundreds of letters that she gets every day from women like Annette, right, saying, should I join the movies? Looks like you're having a great time and you're making all this money. And her response to all those fan letters is, this is a hugely extractive, exploitative place. And nobody actually who reads that would really want to join the movies. So it's a kind of a warning to film aspirants. It's not really an instruction manual on how to join the movies, but it's in fact a kind of expose. So what's interesting for me again here with the question of the woman as a modern, the actress as a modern worker and film as a modern workplace, is that we see one actress's process over here of becoming a cine worker, right? Through her struggle against a certain sense of exploitation or injustice, an understanding of her place within that business hierarchy, and her kind of real conviction that there is a way to dialogue with, fight and negotiate this, and that is part of what we understand modern capitalist workplaces to be, with this kind of a tussle between management and workers and so on. That cannot happen until one fully embraces that this is what I am. I am a film worker. And as a worker, this I understand is the boss. And within that hierarchy, these are the demands that I can or cannot place. And she has in the book actually a very interesting kind of 7-tier structure of the industry. She kind of translates class into caste in the book. So she says that the film industry has 7 castes, and the lowest caste includes all the below line workers that one would expect, but it also includes actors and actresses. So she puts herself, even as a star actress, at the bottom of the food chain and kind of understands the struggle in that sense. What's important here is, so what happens after the strike? They break the contract. She's free to do her own thing, and she sets up her own production company. It's called Shanta Apte Concerns. Now, it's important to note that at this time, and yeah, I'll just skip this. At this time, film actresses are amongst the most litigious constituents in the legal scene, right? So film actresses are constantly being sued or are suing. And you'll constantly see cases like this: Bombay cinema artist in court, case against Bombay film actress, defamation of film actress, suit against Sita Devi. And the charges will often be something ridiculous, like the actress has stolen a necklace from the studio or something. But as you probe it, you realize that basically they are suing these actresses because they're trying to break their contracts, because they are the most valued kind of assets and commodities of film studios. Without the actress, right, the studios are not able to kind of, so if someone chooses to work not with Shantaram but with, say, Himanshu Rai, they get sued in these other ways. There's kind of a punishment for trying to kind of break the contract. And what's interesting again is through this kind of litigation work, once again we see the actress becoming this very peculiarly modern worker, peculiarly modern kind of historical figure. And now I want to come to the last of the set of stories that I want to tell today, and I want to turn from the highly visible figure of the film actress to her less visible colleagues, background artists. So I just want to note that while it is already extremely difficult to recover the biographies and work histories of even prominent actresses like Shanta Apte from a pre-independence moment, it is almost impossible to do this kind of recuperative work for women workers who are further down the industrial hierarchy. Which is why, to be able to tell the stories that I'm going to tell now, I had to look at some very for a film historian, very unconventional archives, like police cases and court cases, because these women only emerge in a historical archive when something terrible happens to them, right? Some kind of assault, injury, death, and so on. And that's when they insert themselves into the historical record. So, I mean, in the US, I would always do a trigger warning. I don't know where we are at in Bombay with that. But this is a story of sexual assault, right? And this is something that I found reported in a magazine. And it's about an incident that takes place in April 1945. And a judgment that finally takes place a few years after, where the full bench of the Bombay High Court confirms the conviction of 3 persons connected with the film industry who were charged with committing rape, criminal assault, and abetment on Nalini D, 18, an extra girl. Now, on the night of April 14th, 1945, I'm going to now give you the context. Some extra girls or background artists were required by the famous director K. Asif, not famous then, it's his first film, but it's a big budget film. It's called Phool or Flower. Now, this is Asif's first film, and it is being envisioned on a scale that really gives us glimmers of the scale of, say, Mughal-e-Azam. So, this is just a representative image to give you a sense of the scale of Phool and what the background artists, like what kind of position they would have had perhaps in that mise-en-scène, because you can see the main actress in the middle and you see a bunch of background dancers and artists arrayed in the back. Now, Phool was being shot at Mohan Sound Studios in Andheri, and 35 female background artists were required. They arrived for a night shoot at 8 p.m. One of them was an 18-year-old woman, Nalini D. Now, junior artists often have to wait for several hours on set, often in full costume and makeup, while the lead actors retake their shots or technicians work out lighting and lensing and so on. And so Nalini and the other extra girls, after they completed their makeup, were told to wait outside the studio until they were required on set. Nalini went and sat down under a tree in the studio compound. Now, the very fact that the extras did not have any designated waiting area indicates their so-called place, right, on the margins of the film industry. Now, at some point when these women are waiting, the junior artist supplier starts to make sexual advances towards Nalini. She rebuffs him, he is enraged, and he dismisses her from work. He says, okay, then you don't need to, you go back. Now, Nalini has come with some young boy, it could be her brother, like a chaperone. So, Nalini and her brother, or this young boy, they start to walk towards Andheri station. And this is now 11 p.m. So, Nalini has clearly no recourse to complaint or redressal. She is dismissed arbitrarily, she accepts it, she starts walking to the station. Now, according to a news report, the road from the studio to the train station was dark and deserted. The junior artist supplier follows the girl with 2 of his friends and assaults her. The judge for the case sentenced ultimately all 3 accused to rigorous imprisonment for 5 to 7 years, and he is very harsh also for the producers and the director. And he says that it should be obvious, and I am quoting from the judgment, that to take 30 or so young girls to Mohan studio in the suburbs at night causes on the management which brings them there a duty to see that their business is properly conducted, end of quotes. So, we are seeing a lot of things that are being encoded in that statement, which include what are the conditions that make it possible for such an event of violence to take place at all. So, there are many factors obviously here, from management negligence to the time at which the incident takes place to the location at which the incident takes place, right, which helps us understand the vulnerability of the body of the female junior artist within this entire space of the cine ecology. Now, I just wanted to check on Google Maps that Mohan's studio still exists in Andheri. What avatar it is of the 1940 studio, I am not exactly sure. But this would have been the walk that she did from Mohan's studio to Andheri railway station. Now, today, August 11, 2022, this might be one of the busiest roads, right? In not just Bombay, but in India. But back in 1945, it would have been truly desolate, especially at 11 p.m. Now, in the silent era, Bombay's biggest studios were located not in Andheri and so on, but in Dadar. And that would be, there's a little dense kind of a portion that I've marked up here. So this is where all the Bombay big studios used to be in the silent period. And Dadar had such a dense population of film companies that it was known, Dadar was called India's Hollywood. So when people said India's Hollywood, it wasn't like Bombay or anything, it was very specifically Dadar, right? It's a bit surprising to think about that today. And it made a lot of sense because Dadar was a center of a lot of commercial activity, well-connected trains and so on, electricity. But what changed is the talkie film, because talkie film was shot using synchronized sound on location, and you needed to have a quiet environment to be able to shoot. You can't be shooting in the middle of the busiest commercial hub like Dadar. So historically, film studios across the world have been located on the edges or suburbs of cities, in quiet places where they can have lots of space for big studios and sound stages, and also where you can have silence. So since the coming of the talkies in that sense, Bombay's film studios and companies started moving further north. So what we're seeing in the movement further north is also how film is able to help us also track urban sprawl and urban growth. So as the city keeps expanding, right, northwards, and more parts of this region become part of the city limits of Bombay, we see also the studios tracking that movement, right, ever and ever north. So obviously today Andheri is again not the hub of, and film has moved even further north still. So as the city expands, its film industry also keeps shifting along its edges. So that's one kind of an interesting thing to note here. The other thing is that what is this Mohan Sound Studios? Why is it located in this place? And Andheri at this time is still quite a forested, kind of a wooded place, which is a bunch of villages, and there's a lot of, it's possible to still expand and buy real estate there. And this is also 1945, so it's still towards the end of the Second World War. And the Second World War brought in a huge influx of cash into the Bombay economy and into the film economy. And there was also an all-time high in terms of attendance at movies during the war years. Because there was not just locals that were watching films, there was a huge amount of military population. So like US soldiers and people from all over the Allied forces world were in the city, and there was a lot of black economy and cash that was moving around. So this really increased the demand for films and increased money that could be spent to set up independent film companies. So a lot of film companies opened up almost overnight, right? These fly-by-night companies, and they didn't have any stable assets like Ranjit or Sagar or Bombay Talkies had. So they survived on a rental economy. So Mohan Studios was one such place that would hire its sound stage out to anyone that had money for that one shoot. So K. Asif is one of those independent producers, right, who doesn't have anything in terms of a stable kind of capital assets, but he has money to pay for that rental of Mohan Sound Studio for whatever week and so on. So what we're also seeing here is a gap between the aspirations, right, of this industry that's like struggling to kind of explode, expand, do something with the cash that's coming in, but a gap between that aspiration and the infrastructural reality of what is actually possible to do. And one of the things that I start the book with is that we have to remember this is a highly speculative economy and a speculative place. A lot of stuff is happening based on borrowed money, money that's coming through various dubious sources, money that is moving in because neither the colonial government nor banks want to touch this as an industrial form, right? And that introduces a lot of precarity into the film business from the very top to the very bottom. And hence there's a huge floating population of informal workers, informal labor, informal sound stages and studios, and Nalini is part of that informal labor population that you can't track. She might do a film one day, she might be dismissed another day, and you'll never hear of her perhaps again. So when we track this kind of walk, right, of Nalini from Mohan Sound Studio to Andheri station, there are things that we can also start to see spatially in that fraught kind of walk at 11 p.m., right? And that these surface promises of cinema and the infrastructural realities of the city, there's a big gap between those things, right? There's a gap between the talk, the aspiration, and the material reality. And we also see the added layers of precarity that are attached to gendered work. The structural dangers of being a woman at work or being a class marked body or a caste marked body. And here it's interesting to just give you one last example, this time from 1932, to give you a comparison. So this was from 1945. Now in July 1932, we come across this instance where an actress was ordered to pay rupees 10. Who was suing her this time? It's a taxi driver. He says, I dropped her to Gamdevi police station, but she didn't pay me my bhada, so please get my money back. Now what happened here? Miss Enid Proudfoot and 6 other ladies were hired to dance in oriental costumes by the Sagar Film Company. The shoot had ended at 1 a.m. And according to their lawyer, Enid Proudfoot and her colleagues expected that some conveyance would take them home at 1 a.m. But there was no such arrangement in place. So they hired a taxi and they said, we want to go to Gamdevi police station to file a complaint because why is there no conveyance for us? And we know that this thing happened because the taxi driver said, I took them to the police station, but they didn't pay me. So I need my 10 rupees. But it's interesting that clearly, unlike Nalini, Enid Proudfoot felt entitled to make a complaint, right? My employers should have dropped me home. It is 1 a.m. This is ridiculous. I'm going to file a police complaint. Nalini clearly didn't feel that same kind of sense of that kind of an empowered kind of a sense. Now, it is likely, possibly one can only conjecture in moments like this, that it is perhaps Enid Proudfoot's racial status, and I'm guessing based on her name, or her knowledge of English, because she is quoted in some of these reports, that empower her to demand compensation for a late night shift. And this hypothesis is slightly supported by the fact that Enid's lawyer, Mr. Franklin D'Souza, when he is asked by the judge who are the employers of Sagar Film Company, this lawyer, Enid's lawyer, just disparagingly says they are some baniyas. Now there is some obviously casteist contempt here for a local kind of a mercantile class. So clearly the point that I'm trying to make is, again, gender in itself doesn't explain the whole story, nor does the fact that Andheri is a suburb explain the whole story, right? There are clearly many different factors, whether it's gender, caste, ethnicity, the infrastructure of the city, the fact that it's a war economy, that all combine to make some bodies more vulnerable than others and some bodies more vocal than others. So I will now conclude. Just bear with me for another minute. Now the levels of embodied precarity across classes of female cine workers were undoubtedly incommensurable. So on no account am I saying that all bodies and all women were equally vulnerable or faced the same situations, but clearly there are many slender and slim clues in the archives of Indian cinema that show that there was a shared vulnerability, right, across the cine ecology. There would be obviously differences to degrees, but there is something very particular happening with the female cine worker, her body, her status, and her precarity in the cine ecology. And these are experiences that remain generally submerged in the history and even in the continuing present of film industries, not just in India but across the world. And it's a difficult kind of work to do, and for those that may be interested here, it's the work of feminist and queer historians that has really helped me to develop some methods to be able to work with very slim clues and try to kind of densify some of these stories and present them to you as coherent narratives, which they definitely weren't when I encountered them in the archive. So I want to end with this word hustle that's in the title of my book that will help me kind of just tie together some of what I've presented today. To hustle means to move swiftly and hurriedly, or to compel another, someone else, to move rapidly. It means to jostle and push. And this is just the basic dictionary definition of the word hustle. But it helps me think very carefully about the labors of both the working body and the desiring self. It allows me to move across different scales from a macro kind of a perspective, war economy, independent producers, speculative finance, to the micro, right? What's happening with one woman waiting in a studio compound at 11 o'clock at night. So from the big picture of industry to the little gestures of intimate labor. And I've tried very consciously to populate the book with many, many voices, right? Distinct, some contradictory, some directly antithetical, that informed film practice and were in turn informed by the movies. And so in the book you will meet film fans like Annette, who eagerly is awaiting a big break, a junior artist like Nalini, who's patiently waiting outside a studio, or a producer entrepreneur. So Sabita Devi that you saw in Jeevan Lata is also a producer entrepreneur, sets up her own company, who was doing a different kind of speculative work. She's anticipating future profits as a producer on the risks that are taken today. Each of these figures, right, is located in a very different relation to time and to the future. But they're all in some ways oriented to this thing that will happen in the future, this kind of idea of something that is yet to come. And this kind of orientation of all these figures, right, that are working in, dreaming in cinema towards the future is what I'm trying to indicate with the word hustle. Because hustle is also a form of speculative action. It's a gamble on the future, right, from a site where you're immediately actually vulnerable and precarious. And it's also a word that we're all used to today in many ways, because words like gig economy, for example, we are all very familiar with them. And in many ways, it's this moment of the film industry in Bombay that really is one of the places where this gig economy kind of hustle is most starkly kind of starting to consolidate. These are what we call today creative industry workers, right? And these are also people that are hustling in the self-entrepreneurial way with no interest in what the gig economy is not interested in, right? Pension, 9-to-5 job, all of those things. And these are people who are gambling on their lives, on their bodies, because they are doing what they think and which truly is creative, artistic work. And for that work, they're willing to sacrifice all these other things, those benefits. That is very similar to how we think about precarious industries today. And so these are all hustlers. And without hustlers, both then and today, we clearly wouldn't have this very vexing, difficult, but amazingly fulfilling city and its cinema industry, which is Bombay and Bombay cinema. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a vibrant talk, but also a wonderful book. While reading it, you know, I had that like jumping up and down feeling often that I was excited. It reminded me actually around 20 years ago, I was making this film called Unlimited Girls. And I was just asked to make a film on feminism, like that broadly. So when the sky is the limit, you obviously don't know where to start. And I was casting around for clues, and I went to an exhibition, a photo exhibition at a feminist center in Delhi, and it was about women of India from 1800 and something to 1947. And of course, it's always exciting to look at archival photos, but I remember looking through and feeling like I can't relate. I can't see the women of my family, all of whom I think were notable in their own journeys. And there was something so respectable about the way that history was being told, that I felt, for me, it was a very informing moment, because I just thought, like, I can't possibly tell the history of feminism in this extremely sober way. So I think in some ways your book is an argument also of that kind, against this binary of sobriety and worthlessness, right? Like the binary between what is worth telling as history and what is just some kind of irrelevant occurrence that can pass us by. It's not worth recording. And it also reminds me of something a music collector that I interviewed in another film said to me, that, you know, there are things that people don't value that are preserved in museums, and there are things that museums don't value that people collect. So actually, histories of love, in a way, preserve the stories that institutions maybe don't preserve. But I'm really very interested, I mean, obviously there's a lot to think about and discuss in the way that you're telling the history of film as a history of women, and vice versa. But before we talk about that, I'm interested in the fact that the subtitle of your book is, you know, making movies in a colonial city. If you could talk about that a little bit more. And also, why, there's an investment, right, for you in telling the story in this particular way. These polyphonic kind of stories, and most of all, what you're calling the history of practice, which also becomes an experiential history. In a sense, it's a history of bhav, of emotion, and it's therefore not a kind of cold and detached history, but it's an impassioned storytelling history. What is your investment in telling history of film in this way?
So that's a bunch of great and deep questions, and I could talk about that, I guess, all evening. Maybe I'll just start with the colonial city question. There's actually a lot of debate amongst urban historians, city historians, about how accurate or is it to say colonial city, port city, this city and that city. For me, it was actually just very important, because when I had started doing this work, and I had started doing this work way back when I was actually working in Bombay, and I got very intrigued by where is this film industry coming from, why do we behave in these ways, why are there these certain hierarchies, why is there song and dance, why is there dialogue delivery in this way. And I was obviously very interested, because I had already had quite a journey before I came into film work as a feminist in Delhi, and trying to understand what it meant to live a life of a feminist and so on. So I was always interested in the women's work question. But it was much later that I got interested in the colonial question, that this is not just about recovering stories of women in early cinema, but it's a very particular time in the history of Bombay and the history of this nation to be. And it's a colonial city, and that colonized status of the place is really impacting a lot of the stuff that I'm thinking about. So for example, I realized that in order to tell any part of the story, I had to tell the money part of the story. So because it is a colonized place, the colonial government is not interested at all in encouraging, supporting a very lowly indigenous cultural form, even though it's arguing that it has industrial worth and so on and so forth. The colonial government is only interested in cinema as a possibly problematic place for nationalist propaganda. So they only look at films to censor them. So they're not interested in encouraging this as an art form and so on. So this kind of neglect of state support in that moment, which is very unique worldwide, because most other prominent film industries of the 20s and 30s are getting state support in some way or the other. And whether we think about Germany or Japan, right, it's quite a different case. So that creates this highly speculative, vulnerable, precarious kind of financial context, which then has this ripple effect, and it affects every aspect down the chain. Right, so the money is precarious, it's coming in from all these unpredictable and volatile sources, and it makes every part of the chain volatile. So from the studio structure, to the salaries that can be paid, to how many people will be informal. So that is one part of the colonial problem. And the other part is not so directly material, but it is epistemic, right? So it is more to do with how one views the world, and part of colonial modernity rests on the binary creation of certain binaries, right, where the colonizer embodies certain values like modernity, rationality, masculinity, and so on, and it automatically then creates this binary that the other, which is then the racially inferior, is the feminine, the emotional, the more corporeal, the natural. And if those binaries, which are fundamental to modernity across the world, are being incubated in a colonial context, they then start to pervade society. They're with us today, and they have had very dangerous consequences, right? That why are these two values, right, hierarchical and oppositional, when they can coexist and all of that, and we know that from many other alternative knowledge systems. So both these things, to tell a very long kind of response to your question, both these questions of how one was viewing the world within a system where there was this racial, structural governance power hierarchy, and the material question that this is a highly bereft and neglected, what Priya Jaikumar calls a survivalist cinema, right? It was just constantly hustling.
I think it's interesting also at so many levels, because clearly that way of looking at the world has also become that way of writing history, but also a way that we over here ourselves judge what we think is worthy and not worthy of analysis, and also of some kinds of power, right? So it reminded me once that venerable male sound recordist with whom I had a fight during one of my films about money came to the screening of the final film, and then everybody was praising it, and he said, well, yeah, it's a nice film, but the thing about Paromita, she can make a film about anything. And I thought, that's supposed to be a good thing. But he's actually saying it like, I'm so promiscuous that iska to kuch zameer hi nahi hai, right? So this idea that you have to always have fidelity.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be all over the place, in every place, all the time. Otherwise, there's something so courtesanal and doubtful about you that we cannot possibly consider it worthy. And I feel like that you see in film writing a lot. The incapacity to actually look at Hindi cinema seriously as a history of its own form. And what you're kind of arguing for in the book is to look at it on its own terms, its own occurrences, and actually to develop a historical view from that, which I think it's so urgent, political, feminist and queer, as you said, that actually the idea of the personal as political is very embodied in your book. So anyway, everybody should buy this book for fun and for edification both.
No, thank you. I just wanted to speak just briefly to this question of what are the stories worth telling and what count as history. And clearly, I mean, even just writing a history of cinema, if you ask a historian in a history department, it's not worth telling, right? But if we have worked in, so for me, it's also a very personal kind of a story, right? I have worked in this place. I feel very passionately wounded even today when I see the actresses or industry personages being vilified and demonized, right? Even though I'm sitting in New York. So again, it's a very embodied relation with film. And it clearly is a history worth telling, and I have tried to kind of really make a case for that. Because I think there's a huge amount of work that has happened and continues to happen on the history of Bombay as a city. So urban histories of Bombay, Bombay as a modern place, and so on. And I'm stunned often that people are writing 1930s accounts of Bombay and cinema doesn't even get a footnote, right? And it's not stunning because I love cinema. It's stunning because cinema is such an integral part of everything that is going on in the city at that time. And so I've tried to write a promiscuous kind of a story saying that I cannot think about a 1930s film which is called The Mill, without thinking about the strike that is taking place outside on the streets at that time at the mill, right? Why is it that the characters in the 30s films are often Mazdoors? Mazdoors are protagonists. Where is this coming from? Clearly because the Mazdoor is a very important political protagonist on the streets of the city and has captured the South Asian imagination. Bombay is known to be now the city of militant proletariat agitation. Why is it the villains in films suddenly are stockbrokers? They are not zamindars, right? They are stockbrokers. Because Bombay is a place where the stock exchange and stock exchange volatility, the financial crisis and crashes are really defining everything that's happening in the life of the city. So cinema is negotiating with all these things in such a dramatic way. And I was like, it's time that we really placed film not just at the center of it, but made an argument that these are all interconnected forces. And you can't tell a story about Bombay modernity, Bombay urbanity, Bombay gender, Bombay labor, without thinking of this very important, huge thing that is going on, which is not just impacting thousands in the city, but is actually employing thousands of people in this place. It is a very important industrial space. So I like the word promiscuous too, and I'm trying to think whether you have subliminally put that in my head through your films, because for me cinema itself is a very promiscuous form, and purists will always want to say that cinema is this thing, but cinema is not one thing, and it's constantly borrowing from so many other places, and you really see that in a moment of transition, right? Going from silent to talkie. Cinema is gramophone, cinema is telephone, cinema is radio, cinema is Parsi theatre, cinema is Art Deco, and it's promiscuously kind of, and very successfully bringing it together.
I think also the thing that you said about Mill, the strike, and the idea of Bombay as a city of working people, actually until recently was a very kind of fundamental idea of a Bombay person. I mean, I spent my growing up here in Bombay, and I've lived here as an adult for over 30 years. And I think I do see a slight shift there, that from being a city which saw itself as, can do what you're calling the hustle. At any time of night and day, you can get things done in Bombay. This is a kind of self-image also of people from Bombay. And, within the film industry, there will be some spot boys who will be famous. Like, people want that spot boy, because that spot boy can get you anything at any time, whenever you want. But there will be a hairdresser that is really like, I want to work with that person because in less money she'll be able to do whatever she wants to do. And I must say that as a practitioner, I found a curious shift that has occurred, into a branch too within the industry. Like from this idea of I am the person who can do anything, I can make it happen, to a lot of interactions which are like, oh, the budget is too low, so we can't do it. So there's kind of a shift in the imagination of what it means to be a Bombay person. But I wondered, after having been stuck in traffic for 2 hours today, about the idea of the city as increasingly static rather than hustling and jostling, and what that means for the relationalities and filmmaking of this city.
That's just such a beautiful question. What does it mean? I mean, for me, the question in the book, just to kind of try and think with you on what it means to be stuck and static in the traffic. For me, one very important concept, an experience that for me provided then a scholarly concept, was waiting. What does it mean to wait in that traffic for 2 hours? It means that you want to get to a particular place, and at some point you're willing to wait in that car. And I'm not saying that I'm just now riffing off of that, right? And one of the questions I was trying to ask in the book is, what does it mean to do film work? What is film as work? And clearly there's no clear answer to that, because film is so many things. Someone who does film work could be a tailor. Someone else who's doing film work could be a writer, right? So there are many different skills. But there are some experiences of filmmaking that are common to everybody, and everyone remarks on them. One of them is waiting. You're always waiting on a set. You're always waiting for something or someone or some equipment. I see many friends from my film days here. You're waiting, and you're waiting at different times. Some people wait more than other people. So what does it mean to wait, and what can one do with this category of waiting? And it also helped me to think beyond the film set. So there are other people who are also waiting to be discovered at Cafe Coffee Day. Right? Someone is going to a gym, they're doing very active work, but they're also waiting, right? They're building their body while something will happen in the future. So this entire kind of desire to be a part of this thing, which is the cine ecology, a lot of it is different kinds of waiting. And for me, it's not static, it's very active. You're sitting and waiting at home for the phone to ring because you don't have a cell phone, or the PG landlady has a cell phone. वो agent का phone आएगा. But you're waiting there, but it's very active because you're also doing other things. You're getting a portfolio shot. Then in the evening, you're going to go and sit strategically at a place because you've heard वहाँ पे directors आते हैं. So for me, that waiting is not a passive thing. It's a very active, productive kind of labor. Like one of the first associations I joined, and I was just telling a friend, I think I still have my Film Writers Association card, right? Which we all just got made. It was one of the few places where we felt that there would be some kind of safeguard if you're part of this association. And I was very interested. My whole project began with an interest in Saadat Hasan Manto and his writings on Bombay city and cinema, which for me were the closest thing to an ethnographic account of film work and experience and life in this time period. And I was like, the progressive writers, and Manto obviously had a fraught relationship with the progressive writers, but a lot of them joined the film industry as lyricists and writers and so on, and they were writing a lot of very leftist, right, pro-labor, anti-capitalist kind of writing, but somehow they were unable to see that the place they were working in also had workers that were being exploited. So the figure of the mazdoor in the factory was constantly resuscitated over and over again. And many of them also had a very ambivalent relationship to film as vocation. So if you would ask some of them, they'd say, this is just like my side hustle. I'm actually a writer. This is not my real writing, right? And if you read some of the memoirs and biographies, and so they themselves think that the film, because we like to say, look at all these guys, right? And they were very important, they were very important. But for them, they were unable to kind of think about the questions of work, labor, class struggle on the terrain of cinema because it wasn't really their real vocation. And so for me, there were only two people who really directly said that we are workers as film practitioners. One is Shanta Apte, and the other, I guess no surprises, is K. Abbas. I don't know anybody else in the 40s who is saying this is work because they want it to be art. And they find that art and work cannot go together.
Said that in your methods, you looked at feminist history, feminist historians and queer historians to devise your own methodology. Can you tell us a little bit more about that excavation and what you found there that helped you?
So the reason that feminist, queer, and also black historians, right, that have been useful for me to think with is because the state of the archives for the protagonists they want to write about is very similar to the state of the archive here. So for example, I always begin my talks by saying that 95% of all films that were made in the 30s and 40s are now considered lost films. So I have presented lists of courtroom films to you today and discussed all of this stuff. These films don't exist. You will not be able to watch them. I have not watched them. I have watched a handful of films that have survived. They belong to a few studios. There's a whole reason and politics of archives and archiving and so on that goes into it. So when one is dealing with such a fraught kind of an archive that is almost absent, right? And you're dealing with absence, then how do you ask the questions that you really want to ask? And where do you get the answers from? So this is a question that feminist historiographers have faced for decades, right? Also, we were told that there were no women that worked in Bombay till the 1990s, or there was no, there was never a script or continuity script till Farhan Akhtar came in, or there was never this, that and the other, right? And it's true that maybe at that point there had been a gap. And it did seem new at that time, but we have a kind of we've never looked for those histories before, and so you find that there are women producers, actresses, music composers, directors, screenwriters. Of course, they're very few in number, but they are there. So what I was getting in terms of method from all these other scholars is how to stitch together fraught or slight archives and how to really rethink the idea of evidence itself, right? So a lot of them are doing what some would call, say, a speculative historiography, right? That you don't give up on asking the question because there is nothing there for you. So for example, there are some film historians in India who said at one point, if a film doesn't exist, you cannot write about it, right? So one of the things that I did is I said, I'm going to write about all these films that don't exist, but not because I'm inventing a story, because I'm going to look elsewhere. I'm not going to fixate on that 35 print that is lost. I'm going to look at reviews in newspapers. I'm going to look at stills that still exist in some families' archive. I'm going to look at autobiographies, court cases, police cases. And then you find that there is so much to say about that lost film, right? So it's just trying to find alternative sources and refusing to say that, okay, this question will never be answered. So there's a lot of inspiring, I think, scholars out there that have helped. I do want to actually state that Cinema City, Project Cinema City was hugely inspiring for me, and also the exhibition that was mounted and so on. And there's a lot of great work. I think like work that, say, Art Deco Mumbai is doing, stuff that Majlis and Sparrow and all of them started all those years ago. There's many kind of creative ways in which one can tell history, and there's no one genre in which it needs to be told, and all of it comes together to create a kind of dense and thick kind of an account of a time and a place and people.
I mean, I guess it strikes us well that films, even if the prints don't exist, films exist inside us, right? Like you remember a song from a film, even if you don't remember the film, so the film is actually in you as well.
When we are taught the cinema history, world cinema history in schools, I'm from, so
schools are always starting to say world cinema history.
yeah. So like we would study Russian film history, and there would be talk of Eisenstein, who came up with a certain form of cinema, which is montage, or when we study American film, in the history we talk about the studios and how it was something else that was driving, and how these two people, the two world cinemas, were also talking to each other, or German cinema, which is what expressionism, and it was a lot of painters or artists who were entering the cinema. But when there is very little about Indian cinema history as such, and absolutely very less about the form, as if we were coming up with anything new. Do you, like when you wrote the book, do you have anything to say about the form?
That's such a great question. I think I have some of those world cinema books. I also teach cinema, I also studied it, and whenever we were taking that big film world cinema course, say it's like 16 weeks, right? There'll be 1 week in which they'll put India and Japan together. At least that's the way it was taught in the US. And there was a very easy formula. Satyajit Ray is India, Kurosawa is Japan, Ray loved Kurosawa, and that's the end of the story, right? But and often in those stories, the Indian cinema early form got reified as the Hindu mythological. So often you'll see that in some of the things, what was silent cinema in India, what was Indian about it? It was that it was cinema about gods and goddesses. Now that's easy, it sounds obviously very plausible, but again it's an incomplete story, right? And somehow people are still resistant, even though there's a marvelous book by Rosie Thomas, Bombay Before Bollywood, where she says that at this, again it's also linked to what survives and what doesn't survive. If we don't have films to watch, how are we going to try and write about the aesthetics of those lost films, right? So she says that a lot of the films that survived are the Hindu mythologicals, Falke and so on, but there's a huge number of films that are lost that one knows were Arabian Nights fantasy stories. They were Islamicate tales. Now obviously in a time like today, It could be either attractive for some people or very provocative for some other people to say, look, there's a Hindu mythological on one side and an Islamic cinema on one side. What is the history of Indian cinema, right? But again, this is a content kind of question. Formally, they are both quite similar because they are premised on the attractions model, which you know from Tom Gunning and so on. That cinema is best suited to provide spectacle and sensation. These are both special effects kinds of forms, right? So whether it's a god rising up in a chariot into the air or a saint, or whether it's a jinn that is disappearing into air, they're thinking of cinema as a form that is very primed for creating spectacle and magic. So in that sense, there are ways that one can do this, but more work will have to be done because we are really dealing with a loss of the film image. We can't really write so much about the sonic space of these movies, the visual space of these movies, because we have a very few things and they can't stand in for everything that happened at that time. So instead, what we do have a lot of is the movement kind of a history. So the art cinema movement, Indian cinema movement, you know, the parallel cinema movement, the angry young man. So there's a lot of writing in terms of genre and decades that does take place.
I now invite our trustee, Professor Mustan Sudelvi, to give closing remarks and close today's session.
Thank you. And let me first thank both Debashree and Paromita for your absolutely wonderful talk and an equally wonderful interaction. You have, through the course of this lecture and your book, actually opened out so many different ways that we can look at things that we are familiar with, especially in Art Deco Mumbai, and personally with my interest in that period, especially from an architectural point of view. It is a time, I think, when the city is moving from, you know, the port kind of legacy into a more mercantile and into a more business oriented city, and we see that through the buildings which come up at the time, because exactly parallel to the time frame that you are talking about in your book, you have the rise of some very iconic buildings which are mostly banks or insurance companies, which we tend to look at now as great examples of Art Deco and so on. So in one sense, they call to the system, so to speak, you know, a fairly straight-laced kind of thing. But at the same time, you have a new wave of migrants which are coming to the city. Educated, white-collar, you know, people to work and inhabit these, which makes us very easily forget the entire cohort of people that you have talked about. You know, and I think bringing them to the forefront allows us to see a lot about the city as we know it, because this is exactly the time that our city develops into the image that we very subliminally kind of, you know, look at. When we imagine Bombay, that is the kind of image we have that is developing at this time. And it is exactly at this time, as you say, probably you find the origins of the hustle. And you have shown the hustle in this specific kind of space, but I do believe that that would be happening in all other kinds of spaces as well. In architecture, for example, that entire period is dominated by the first generation of Indian educated architects. Art Deco is not a foreign thing in Bombay. It is made by people who have studied in Bombay itself and have set up their practices. Okay, so the origins of the hustle probably lead us through the entire history of what happens later on, and a certain sensibility, I think, which still remains with us. Okay, and we all know that in Bombay things are done in certain ways, you know, and they are not done in ways that are kind of written down. And this occasionally causes some concern for people who are not from Bombay to try and understand the city. So your lecture here is helping us to develop a certain nuance about our own sensibilities, which I think is so important, for us to understand. I will not talk much about, the role of women, which you have already talked about in detail. But since I don't know much about the historical kind of, trajectories, I just limited to that. My role here is to give thanks, so that is what I will do. So thank you very much for giving us this absolutely wonderful lecture, to both of you for this lovely discussion, and to this space, which is really a great space, less than a year old, I think, which is now, making our city richer just by being here and by kind of reinvigorating this part of the city. So thank you very much, and the audience, thank you for being here. And I'd like to call upon Atul Kumar of Art Deco Mumbai to end the proceedings.
Thank you, Professor. Just a small token of appreciation for you, Paromita, from us, and one for you, Debashree. Thank you so much. That was